Hey guys, so with the release of Redshift 3.047, there's been a ton of new features and improvements. Um, Full OCIO version 2 support, so we now have a default ASIS pipeline and a lot of other cool features. But before I go on a whole different tutorial discussing that, I wanted to talk about this new neat feature for Blender users and for the Redshift community at large. And so this has been requested for quite a while to be added to Blender, and it's finally happened. And so this allows you to load Redshift proxies or save Redshift proxies and load them in any other Redshift capable application. So for studios or individuals who use multiple applications, this is awesome. This means that now you could use your old assets that you've made in Cinema 4D, Maya, Houdini, as Redshift proxies and load them in directly into Blender, or vice versa, create assets in Blender, shade them, and send them back to any other package. And so for people that like to model in Blender, this is great. People can model and shade in Blender and send it over to any other package. So here we go. We've got 2.93.1 loaded up. Redshift now supports this. It does include its own plugin because previous Blender builds used a different version of Python. So it has its own unique installer moving forward. So when you guys install it, like I've shown in other videos using the add-on installer, make sure you pick the 2.93 zip file. So anyways, we've got a new scene. And I'm going to just kind of explain the workflow for proxies, how to save them, how to load them, and how to save a whole scene as a proxy. So to start, let's actually just hide our cube for now. And let's make a grid, or a plane as Blender calls it. I'm a Houdini user, guys, so a lot of this I'm going to use different names. Let's do 20 by 20 by 20. I know that the Z doesn't matter, but it's just what I'm used to doing. And we're going to load in a proxy. So we're going to come up to add. Under mesh, you'll see that we have this option called add Redshift Proxy. And actually I need to switch over our renderer to Redshift. And I'm going to turn on GI while I'm here to brute force. Let's come up here, go to proxy, add Redshift Proxy. And so before I actually load it in, let me explain what a proxy is, because I don't think Blender has an equivalent to this. And some renderers don't actually have something like this. And so what a proxy is it's a file that is pre-processed into Redshift native GPU format, and it's saved to disk. So what happens is it does not actually load in your viewport. It just uses a stand-in, so a box, but it actually loads the full asset that you saved as a proxy and the shaders all directly. And so the benefit of this is that it's already processed, so it loads very quickly to the GPU, and it saves you VRAM because your viewport does not get heavier by displaying complex geometry. So what do I mean by that? Let's show you. So we have our RS proxy selected. We're going to come over here to the geometry options, and you'll see that we have this little tick box. It says select proxy file. So we need to click this and go to a proxy file from disk. And so when I click this, I already have a tree that I've made almost a year ago in Houdini. And so we've got this tree. We're going to load that up. And you'll notice that it doesn't actually look like anything in the viewport yet. And so we need to click the reset proxy bounding box. And so this will give you the true scale of the object. And right now, the Blender integration for proxies is not complete fully. So in other applications, you have an option to show this as the original geometry or a point cloud instead of just a bounding box. But typically, most people just use the bounding box because this is the most lightweight viewport method. And so this keeps your VRAM from your GPU from being used up by the display viewport. So if I just start rendering this, we'll see what happens here. it will just kind of pop in. And so this is our full tree asset. Now, if you haven't rendered this proxy in a while, maybe the texture cache is no longer there. So it might take a little bit to process all your textures again and cache them out. But once it's done, it will be really fast to render. So you can just switch back and forth, and you'll see we have our full shaded tree. And this is a pretty heavy asset. I think it's like 2 million polys or something, but just incredible performance, very fast. There's no denoising. Redshift still does not have a denoiser in Blender, so this is just rendering live here. And yeah, works just like that. Awesome. And so this lets you transfer a proxy asset to any other application. Now, to make a proxy, let's disable the rendering and visibility on that. And let's just make a cube and a cone. Let's scroll down here. Scoot this over. Let's select both objects, and I'm going to just move them up. And so what you could do is, if you want to save an individual object, all you have to do is, with the object selected, again, go to the object parameters, and there's an option called Redshift Proxy. And so you want to check this on, and you need to select a path to where this proxy is going to be saved to. So in our case, I'm going to just save it into our project folder, and I'm going to just hit accept. And so this should save it directly there. And if I hit export to proxy, we should get a file with the same name. So if I hit export to proxy, let me open up the folder. And so because it's only using the 2 forward slashes, you'll see that I have a temp folder. And here we go. We've got our scene cube 1 proxy. And it's only 3 kilobytes because, well, it's not much to it. So that's how you can proxy out an individual asset. But what happens if you want to proxy multiple objects or your entire scene as a whole? So in order to do that, you have to come up to the render settings, and there's this checkbox called Scene as Proxy. So when you activate this, you'll have the option to include a camera, to compress the file to get a smaller file size, and the connectivity. By default, that is not selected. And so if you were to just render this out right now, you would get your whole scene minus the camera, which is fine. If you, for example, wanted to send this all to Houdini or something. But how it works is it renders only what is currently renderable. So you see that we have these render and visibility options. So right now it's going to render everything that we have. And so if I were to hit render, and it's going to use the same temp path, you can, of course, override this to be any other path. You hit render. Unfortunately, Blender always pops up the render view. And this is just due to the fact that Blender's render command it currently doesn't have an option to not pop this up. So we're hoping that they'll add a little feature in the API so that we could just disable this from popping up, but still generate the proxy render to disk. And so we should now have in our temp folder here, yeah, we have scene 001, and that is our actual everything that's renderable here. And so what happens if you want just a specific collection, right? So I'm going to just call this full scene. You could add a new collection, and we could just drag in the objects we specifically want. So we wanted the cone and the cube. And this is the same way it works in Houdini, actually. So then you could just disable everything for the other groups or the other collections and only keep these two objects visible. And now if we render this out, it will generate another file. And you'll notice that the kilobyte size is a little bit smaller. Instead of 11, it's 7 this time. And that's because it's only these two objects. And so we could just call this cone box. And so we hope in the future to have this group writing out to disk a little more UI friendly, but that's the way to do it for now. It's not too complicated. Typically, I recommend people don't do groups like this. It's better to just proxy out individual assets if you plan on scattering them, or proxy the entire scatter itself. And speaking of scattering, I'm actually going to show you guys how to do that. So let's hide all these objects for now. Let's turn back on our grid, and actually our cube, we could just disable this. And let's reactivate our proxy tree. Let's just call this tree proxy. Let's save. And so we're going to select our grid. We're going to come up here and use the new geometry node editor. And so if you guys are used to Houdini, this is very familiar. We're just going to click add new. We've got our output, our input, and so we're going to scatter some points onto this grid. So just start typing point, and we're just going to do a point distribute. And you can see that it added a couple points there. We're going to increase the density. I don't know, you could try 20. And that will generate more points. Then we're going to drop down a point scale. And then an instance. So we get the point instance. And so we're going to point the object we're going to select to instance on those points to our tree proxy. And right now the scale is massive, and that's because the original source proxy is big also. So what we need to do is adjust the point scale. So we're going to try something like 0.01, 0.01, 0.01, and I think that should cover it. So you'll see now we have all these little boxes. And actually we could hide the visibility of the tree proxy so it's not gigantic in the middle. And let's make a new plane. So we have a ground plane to work with. And we'll just make this 30 by 30 by 30. So it encompasses all our scattered points here. Let's save. Let's add a light. So let's do a sunlight, a redshift distant light. Yeah, we could do a distant light. And so you'll see that it made this distant light. And we can control the angle using the little yellow dot widget thing. And under the light settings, it's already set to use the physical sun. Let's click on our little global world properties and switch this to physical sky. And so that will generate the sky and sun for us. And if we start to render this, we should get some scattered trees here and our lighting. So let's activate rendering. Give this a second to prepare. And there we go. Awesome. And as you guys can see, this is just really, really fast. So you could instance thousands of points and copy very heavy meshes. Now, I don't know Blender too well, so I don't know how to randomize which proxy gets loaded and stuff like that. But I'm sure, you guys can figure it out. More of the Blender experienced users will know how to do that using the new features. But I just wanted to briefly cover proxies and how to use them quickly, how to export your proxies, how to export your entire scene, how to load them, and use them for different purposes. And yeah, it kind of gives you an idea of how to work with proxies here. Cool. So hopefully you guys kind of learned something new. I think this is an awesome feature to have, especially for Blender users who also use other Redshift applications. They'll just be able to work with this right out of the gate. By default, Redshift now does render in ACCG. You can change those settings in the Redshift color management section. So you'll see that rendering space is now ACCG. You could switch to using a different look if you want like a contrasty look using the filmic contrast. And yeah, I think you guys kind of get the idea. Oh, and one more thing, if you want to override the contents of a proxy, so let's disable that for now. Let's say you have your proxy file here. So we're going to have it selected and go to the object parameters. Down here, there's several options for the proxy. So right now, the proxy materials are going to come from the proxy itself automatically. And you'll see this is the list of proxy materials. And you can actually override the materials inside of the app. So let's say you wanted to change them for some reason. And so by default, it's going to pick the materials inside the proxy. But you can also do all from one, which means it'll override the entire object. Or you can do from placeholder. And so the placeholder lets you pick a material that has the same name in your scene, and that will override the same named material. So what do I mean by that? Let's switch over to our materials, our shading editor. And let's just make a new material. Let's just call this, I don't know, proxy override. And we're going to just drop down a Redshift output, a Redshift material, and just plug this in. And we're going to do, for the proxy itself, we're going to switch now to from file. Oh, no, from file. So, oh wait, no, that's the, this is the overrides. I'll cover this next. Up here. The all from one. And you'll see that our material here is listed as proxy override. And so if we render this now, it should override all the shaders on our proxy to use this new material we just created. So let's save and give that a try. And there you go. Easy as that. It overrode all the materials to use this gray shader. And so what happens if you want to override a specific material, like we were saying earlier? Let's turn off the rendering. We have these materials here with specific names. So I'm going to just go with, I don't know, the, let's just do the bark. That one's pretty easy, so it'll be obvious. And we're going to create a new material. And let's just call this the exact same name. So we need to use the Houdini naming convention. It's actually picking up the context of Matt and then black gum underscore tree underscore bark. And let's save here. And actually, I think it overrode the material name. But that's okay. So we're just going to change the color. Let's just use a reddish color. And now instead of all from one, we're going to switch to from placeholder. And so what should happen is, because we're using the exact same name as the texture, or not the texture, the shader in the proxy is named, it should override now only where that shader was applied. So let's start the IPR. And yeah, just as we expected, only the bark is now being overridden with this material. So really cool. And this lets you modify shaders if for some reason it got exported and the original scene got destroyed, or you just need to make some modifications with specific material. This lets you override it before it gets sent out. Then we have a couple more options down here to override the object ID that was written to the proxy, tessellation and displacement, if the original has any tessellation displacement, user data, trace sets, or the visibility and matte options. So if you were to activate the tessellation and displacement override, you would come down here and use new settings. The same thing would apply for the visibility, the matte settings, and the object ID. So yeah, really straightforward, guys. Very powerful. And yeah, that just basically covers how to use proxies inside of Blender. And so I think a lot of people will be really happy with this, to be able to just now bring in assets from other apps or export assets from Blender and share them and render them in Redshift efficiently, quickly, even on heavy scatters or heavy geometry, no problem. So yeah, enjoy, guys. And thanks again for all the support on YouTube and Patreon. Have a great day.